Three sisters who share a husband and their horrifying breeding secret, 1876. In the winter of 1876, as blizzards swept through the Rocky Mountains of Montana, USA, a young American journalist named Samuel Whitaker stumbled upon something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden in a secluded valley near the town of Darby, he found the remains of what surviving settlers whispered was the most cursed bloodline in the American West. Three sisters, Abigail, Clara, and Ruth Hawthorne, not only shared a home but a single husband, deliberately creating what medical experts would later call the most genetically isolated family tree in recorded North American history. For over 50 years, Whitaker's sealed reports lay in the archives of the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C., alongside testimonies too terrifying to make public. What happened in that hidden corner of the Bitterroot between 1855 and 1876 defied everything we thought we knew about family survival and the horrifying lengths people would go to preserve what they believed was their pure bloodline. Before we continue the story of the Hawthorne sisters and the horrifying discovery that changed an American journalist's life forever, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this, please remember to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We explore the coldest forgotten stories from around the world that somehow connect back to American history. And let us know in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts who help us bring these buried stories to light, especially those with pioneer or New England ancestry who might recognize elements of these old world secrets. The mountains of western Montana had always been a place the outside world seemed to forget. Even as America tore itself apart in the brutal Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the secluded valleys near the Bitterroot remained largely untouched by the conflict raging across the nation. It was here, in the isolated town of Darby, that the Hawthorne clan had settled for nearly half a century, originally arriving from New England in the 1832 as fur trappers and cabin builders. By 1855, the family consisted only of one man, Jeremiah Hawthorne, and his four children: Abigail, the eldest at 24, Clara, 22, Ruth, 19, and Ezekiel, a mere 17. Their mother, Martha, had died giving birth to a fifth child, leaving Jeremiah to raise his children in complete isolation from the few other settler families scattered across the valley. The closest town of any significance was Missoula, a full day's ride by horse over treacherous mountain passes that became impossible during the harsh winter months. Jeremiah Hawthorne was a man obsessed with what he called the purity of blood. He had spent years studying family genealogies kept in his father's wooden chest, tracing the Hawthorne lineage through meticulously preserved marriage records and birth certificates. What he discovered filled him with both pride and horror. His family, he believed, had remained uncontaminated by what he considered foreign elements. There had been no intermarriages with Native Americans during the pioneer era, no unions with immigrants from other lands, and most importantly, no mixing with local Montana settlers whom he considered genetically inferior. But his problem lay there. As the last surviving male of the Hawthorne line, Jeremiah faced an impossible choice. If he allowed his daughters to marry outside the family, the bloodline he believed was sacred would be forever diluted. If he forbade them from marrying altogether, the lineage would die with him. There was, however, a third option, one that had begun to form in his increasingly disturbed mind during the long, dark winters when the family was completely cut off from the outside world. The four Hawthorne children had been raised to believe they were fundamentally different from others. Their father had instilled in them tales of their noble ancestry, claiming they were direct descendants of early Puritan settlers and that their blood carried special properties that must be preserved at all costs. Abigail, with her sharp features and keen blue eyes, had become her father's main confidant in his genealogical obsessions. Clara, softer and more questioning, often wondered about the world beyond their valley, but had been taught that such curiosity was a sign of moral weakness. Ruth, the youngest of the sisters, had been born with a slight limp that her father explained as a mark of their family's ancient noble lineage, a physical sign, he claimed, that appeared only in the purest bloodlines. Their isolation had shaped them in ways that any outsider would have found horrifying. By 1855, the sisters spoke a dialect almost incomprehensible to other English speakers, mixing archaic English with Montana colloquialisms and even fragments of what appeared to be colonial Puritan English. They wore styles of clothing that were decades out of date, hand-sewn from patterns that had been passed down through generations. Most disturbingly, they had developed relationships with each other and their father that blurred all normal boundaries of family life. As the winter of 1855 approached, Jeremiah Hawthorne made a decision that would reverberate through the decades and eventually reach the ears of a young American journalist 2 decades later. He called his children together in the main room of their cabin and presented them with what he called a sacred mission. He had found, he told them, the perfect solution to preserving their bloodline while ensuring its continuation. The sisters would share a single husband, a distant cousin named Ezekiel Hawthorne, whom he claimed had arrived from a town near Helena. Ezekiel, he assured them, was of pure Hawthorne blood, traceable through his grandfather to the same ancestors they all shared. What Jeremiah did not tell his children was that Ezekiel Hawthorne was no distant cousin at all. He was Jeremiah's own son by his deceased sister, a fact that would make him the girl's half-brother. The deception was carefully orchestrated, aided by forged documents that Jeremiah had spent months preparing. In his twisted logic, this arrangement would not only preserve their bloodline but actually further refine it, producing children whose genetic heritage would be more concentrated than any in their family's history. The arrangement he proposed was methodical and chilling in its calculation. Each sister would spend 1 month as Ezekiel's primary wife, while the other 2 served as companions and assistants. Any children born of these unions would be raised communally with the specific parentage deliberately obscured to prevent favoritism. The sisters would live together in harmony, united in their sacred mission to produce the purest possible offspring. Abigail, ever the dutiful daughter, accepted immediately. Clara expressed concerns, but was quickly silenced by her father's theological arguments about God's will and family honor. Only Ruth seemed to grasp the full horror of what was being proposed, but her objections were dismissed as youthful hysteria. Within a month, Ezekiel Hawthorne had arrived from Helena, a hollow-eyed 7-year-old who seemed to understand his role all too well. The winter of 1856 brought a silence that seemed to swallow the entire Bitterroot Valley. The first snows had fallen earlier than usual, sealing the family cabin off from the outside world until spring. It was during these months of complete isolation that the true nature of Jeremiah's plan began to unfold, and what had initially seemed merely disturbing evolved into something far more sinister. Ezekiel Hawthorne had arrived in November, just as the mountain passes were becoming treacherous. He was a young man marked by hardship, his face more weathered than his years and his hands calloused from a lifetime of manual labor. But there was something else about him, a strange intensity in his dark eyes and a way of speaking that suggested he understood more about the true history of the Hawthorne family than he initially let on. The arrangement began exactly as Jeremiah had planned. Abigail, as the eldest, was afforded the first month to establish herself as Ezekiel's primary wife. The ceremony that bound them was conducted by Jeremiah himself, combining Protestant ritual with what he claimed were ancient family traditions passed down from their Puritan ancestors. There were no outside witnesses, no civil registrations, no connection to the church in Missoula. For all legal intents and purposes, it was no marriage at all, but a carefully orchestrated reproductive arrangement disguised as religious duty. What transpired during that first month would haunt the valley for decades to come. Abigail, who had always been the most compliant of the sisters, began to change in ways that neither Clara nor Ruth could comprehend. She became secretive, whispering with Ezekiel in corners of the cabin and developing what could only be described as an obsession with their father's genealogical charts. She spent hours copying names and dates, creating intricate family trees that showed the theoretical genetic makeup of any children she might bear. But it was during the long evenings as the family huddled around the fire in the main room that the true horror of the situation began to reveal itself. Ezekiel would speak of his childhood in ways that did not align with the story Jeremiah had told of his origins. He mentioned places near Derby that no distant cousin should have known. He recalled people and events from the valley's past with an intimacy that suggested deep personal knowledge. And most disturbingly, he bore an uncanny physical resemblance to Jeremiah himself. The same narrow nose, the same distinctive cleft in his chin, the same unusual blue eyes that marked the Hawthorne bloodline. Clara was the first to voice her suspicions. During the second month, as she became Ezekiel's primary companion, she began to ask pointed questions about his family history. Her inquiries were met with evasive answers and, more disturbingly, with fierce anger from her father. Jeremiah's reaction to any questioning of Ezekiel's origins was so extreme that it confirmed Clara's worst fears. Something was fundamentally wrong with the entire arrangement. It was Ruth, however, who discovered the truth. On a night in February of 1857, as a fierce blizzard had trapped the family indoors for 3 days, she found a cache of letters hidden beneath her father's mattress. The letters, dating back over 2 decades, revealed the full extent of Jeremiah's deception and the true identity of the man who was now successively marrying all 3 sisters. The letters were from Jeremiah's own sister, Eliza, who had died in 1838, shortly after giving birth to an illegitimate son. The identity of the father was never recorded, but the dates and circumstances made it clear that Jeremiah himself was responsible. Eliza had died in childbirth on the Hawthorne homestead, and the newborn, Ezekiel, had been sent away to be raised by distant relatives in Helena. The boy had grown up unaware of his true parentage, believing himself to be an orphaned cousin of the Hawthorne family. But the letters revealed something even more disturbing. Jeremiah had been in contact with Ezekiel for over 5 years, gradually revealing selective portions of the family history while carefully concealing the true nature of their relationship. He had convinced the young man that he was a distant cousin with a duty to help preserve the family bloodline, never mentioning that such preservation would involve marrying and conceiving children with his own half-sisters. The psychological impact of this discovery on Ruth was immediate and devastating. She confronted her father that very night, demanding an explanation for what she had correctly identified as not merely incest, but a form of generational abuse that had been planned for decades. Jeremiah's response was calm, methodical, and utterly chilling in its logic. He explained that traditional definitions of family relations were irrelevant when dealing with bloodlines as pure and ancient as theirs. Normal taboos, he claimed, applied only to ordinary people who had diluted their genetic heritage over generations of careless breeding. For families like the Hawthornes, who had maintained their purity for decades, different rules applied. What others might call incest, he called genetic refinement. What they might call abuse, he called sacred duty. Furthermore, he argued, the results would speak for themselves. The children born of these unions would possess qualities that no normal breeding could produce: intelligence, beauty, and spiritual gifts that came only from the careful concentration of superior bloodlines. They would be, in his words, the perfection that God intended before sin introduced chaos into the natural order. Ruth's horror at these revelations was matched only by her growing realization that there was no escape from the situation. The winter had made leaving impossible, but even when spring arrived, where could she go? She had no money, no connections to the outside world, and no understanding of how to survive beyond the valley that had been her entire universe. More importantly, both Abigail and Clara were already showing signs of pregnancy, binding them permanently to the nightmare Jeremiah had created. As the snow finally began to melt in March of 1857, Ruth made a decision that would haunt the Hawthorne family for the next 2 decades. Rather than flee or continue to resist the arrangement, she would stay and document everything. She began to keep detailed records of daily life in the family, the progression of her sister's pregnancies, and most importantly, the gradual changes in behavior and appearance that began to manifest in the unborn children. The first generation of Hawthorne children arrived in the autumn of 1857, and with them came the confirmation of Ruth's worst fears about the consequences of her father's genetic experiments. Abigail gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, whom she named Amos and Martha, while Clara bore a single daughter, whom she called Eliza, after the aunt none of them had ever known. The births themselves were difficult, requiring Jeremiah to act as midwife as there was no outside medical assistance during the early snow season. From their earliest days, The children exhibited traits that set them apart from any offspring that would have resulted from normal marriages. All three were born with the distinctive blue eyes that had become a hallmark of the Hawthorne bloodline, but their physical features showed signs that Ruth recognized as the inevitable consequence of concentrated breeding. Amos had a pronounced undershot jaw that made speaking difficult, while Martha's fingers were fused between the knuckles in a way that suggested developmental abnormalities. Eliza appeared the most normal of the three, but as she grew, it became clear that her hearing was severely limited, forcing the family to communicate with her through a complex system of hand signals. More disturbing than the physical abnormalities, however, were the behavioral traits that emerged as the children developed. By the age of 3, all three exhibited an unusual interest in family relationships, asking questions about parentage and bloodlines that seemed beyond their years. They showed no interest in the typical games or activities of young children, instead spending hours studying the genealogical charts that covered the walls of the homestead. Most disturbingly, they seemed to instinctively understand that they were part of something secret and important, exhibiting a level of discretion about family matters that was both remarkable and deeply unsettling. The children's development coincided with significant shifts in the adult family structure. By 1860, the original arrangement of rotating marriages had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Abigail, Clara, and Ruth had all borne additional children, totaling 8 offspring by 1865. But the question of specific parentage had become deliberately obscured. Ezekiel continued to rotate his relations with all 3 sisters, but now the older children began to participate in discussions about family planning, offering opinions on genetic combinations and bloodline preservation that sent shivers down Ruth's spine. The isolation that had originally facilitated Jeremiah's plan now became essential to its continuation. The growing family could not risk discovery by outside authorities who would undoubtedly view their arrangements as criminal. This meant no formal schooling for the children, no medical care, and no exposure to normal social relationships. They learned to read and write from family documents, learned arithmetic through genealogical calculations, and developed their understanding of the world entirely through their grandfather's lectures on blood, purity, and genetic superiority. As the first decade after 1860 passed, Jeremiah's health began to decline, and with it came an increasing urgency to establish the second generation of his breeding program. Amos, despite his physical limitations, was being groomed to eventually take on the role of patriarch. His sisters and cousins were being evaluated for their potential as breeding partners with detailed charts tracking their genetic traits and projected offspring qualities. The horror of this situation was compounded by the children's complete acceptance of their predetermined roles. They had been raised to believe that normal family structures were corrupt and inferior, and that their unique arrangement represented a higher form of human organization. As Amos reached adolescence in 1870, he began to express enthusiasm for the day when he could contribute to the family's genetic mission, viewing his future relations with his sisters and cousins not as abuse, but as sacred responsibility. It was during this period that Ruth began to plan her escape, not for herself. She recognized that she was too deeply implicated in the family's crimes to ever find redemption, but rather to rescue any younger children who might still be saved from the cycle of abuse. Her records of family life had evolved into a comprehensive chronicle of 2 generations of systematic incest, genetic manipulation, and psychological conditioning that she hoped could one day serve as evidence for authorities who might intervene. But Ruth's intervention plans were complicated by the political turmoil that was beginning to affect even this hidden corner of Montana. The social tensions that would eventually erupt into border conflicts were already visible in the late 1860s, with increasing instability of settlements and reduced administrative oversight in rural areas. The chaos brewing across the American West would actually provide further cover for the Hawthorne family's activities, allowing them to continue their genetic experiments without fear of discovery. By 1872, the second generation had begun to breed, with Amos fathering children with both his sister Martha and his cousin Eliza. The offspring born showed even more pronounced abnormalities than their parents, including several children born with severe developmental delays and physical deformities that made survival difficult under their primitive conditions. Yet, rather than seeing these results as proof of a failure in his plan, Jeremiah, now in his 60 seconds but still lucid, interpreted them as necessary steps in the refinement process, claiming that the weak children were merely genetic chaff that had to be eliminated before true perfection could be achieved. The family had also developed elaborate rationalizations for the high infant mortality rate that plagued their breeding program. Children who died prematurely were said to have been called back to God because their genetic mission had been fulfilled. Those who survived were considered to have been specially selected to carry on the bloodline. This theological framework helped the adults cope with the fact that roughly half of the children born into the family died before reaching adulthood, often due to complications related to genetic disorders or the primitive medical care available on their isolated homestead. As the 1,870 seconds progressed, the Hawthorne family had grown into a small community of nearly 30 individuals, all descended from the original 3 sisters and their shared husband. The homestead had been expanded several times to accommodate the growing population, but the basic structure of life remained unchanged. Careful genetic planning, systematic inbreeding, and complete isolation from the outside world. In essence, they had created their own closed society with its own rules, values, and understanding of human relationships that bore little resemblance to normal civilization. The autumn of 1869 brought the final changes that would lead to the family's discovery 8 years later. America was entering a period of post-Civil War instability, with border conflicts and increased westward expansion. But for the Hawthorne family, the immediate concern was more personal. The death of Jeremiah at age 75 left them without their founding patriarch and genetic strategist. Amos, now 33 and bearing the physical hallmarks of concentrated inbreeding, premature baldness, severe hand tremors, and teeth that had never properly formed, took over as the leader of the family's breeding program. But his intellectual capacities, limited by developmental delays, rendered him incapable of managing the complex genealogical calculations his grandfather had used to guide mating decisions. The responsibility instead fell to his sister, Martha, who had inherited not only Jeremiah's obsession with genetic purity, but also his calculating intelligence and ruthless pragmatism. Under Martha's leadership, the family's operations became even more systematic and disturbing. She established what she called a breeding schedule, determining which family members would reproduce, with whom, based on detailed analyses of past offspring quality and untested genetic combinations. She also established regular genetic evaluations for all family members, measuring physical traits, testing mental capacities, and assessing what she called bloodline indicators to optimize future breeding decisions. The third generation of Hawthorne children, now numbering over 20 individuals, exhibited the cumulative effects of 20 years of deliberate inbreeding. Physical deformities had become so common that the family had developed specialized techniques for caring for children born with cleft palates, club feet, and various forms of skeletal malformations. Intellectual disabilities ranged from mild learning difficulties to severe developmental delays that rendered some family members incapable of self-care. Yet, these results were still considered acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of genetic perfection. More disturbing than the physical and mental abnormalities, however, was the psychological conditioning that had shaped the third generation's understanding of normal human relationships. The children had been raised from birth to view their siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles as potential breeding partners, exhibiting a complete lack of natural incest taboos. They spoke matter-of-factly about family planning decisions, evaluating the genetic quality of their relatives with clinical detachment, and expressing genuine enthusiasm for participating in what they had been taught was a sacred mission of genetic purification. The family's isolation had also created cultural changes that set them apart from mainstream American society in fundamental ways. Their language had evolved into a dialect that combined technical genetic terminology with archaic Puritan religious concepts, creating a vocabulary almost incomprehensible to outsiders. Their clothing, still hand-sewn from patterns from the 1,850 seconds, immediately marked them as belonging to a previous era. Most importantly, their understanding of time, history, and the outside world remained frozen in their founding period, rendering them living anachronisms in a rapidly modernizing nation. It was during this period that Ruth, now 33 and showing the signs of premature aging common among the family's breeding women, made a final decision that would eventually lead to their discovery. She had spent decades documenting the family's activities in journals hidden throughout the homestead, but now she realized that her records would be meaningless unless they somehow reached outside authorities. The question was how to communicate with the outside world without destroying the family she had helped create and maintain. Her solution was both ingenious and desperate. She began to leave carefully crafted messages in locations where they might be discovered by occasional travelers through the valley hunters, government surveyors, or traders commuting between Missoula and Helena. These messages were written in standard English rather than the family's evolved dialect, and they contained just enough information to pique the curiosity of potential readers without revealing the full extent of the Hawthorne family's activities. The messages described a unique mountain community that had preserved ancient pioneer traditions and might be of interest to scholars studying historical social structures. They included general directions to the homestead and hinted that visitors would be welcomed if they approached with due respect for traditional ways of life. Ruth hoped that these messages would eventually attract the attention of someone with the authority and understanding necessary to intervene in the situation. Her plan might have succeeded, but political events in the American West were moving toward crisis faster than her careful preparations could bear fruit. The post-Civil War era, established in 1865, was marked by increasing social and political polarization that made normal administrative governance difficult. Even in the more accessible areas of the hinterlands, such as the Bitterroot Valley, administrative oversight became almost non-existent as officials focused on more pressing national concerns. The outbreak of border conflicts in 1876 put an end to any possibility that Ruth's messages would receive official attention. The American West was consuming itself in a confrontational conflict between settlers and Native Americans, militia patrols, and fugitives from justice. The secluded valleys of western Montana became havens for deserters, hiding places for outlaws, and no man's lands where normal law enforcement no longer operated. For the Hawthorne family, the border conflicts represented both opportunity and danger. The collapse of governmental authority meant they could continue their activities without fear of official interference. But it also brought armed groups and desperate individuals into their previously safe territory. By 1876, they were encountering hunters, traders, and bandits with increasing frequency, forcing them to develop strategies for dealing with outsiders while preserving their secrets. The family's reaction to this challenge revealed the full extent of their psychological transformation. Rather than seeing the border conflicts as an opportunity to escape their isolated existence, they interpreted it as a confirmation of the superiority of their closed society. The violence and chaos of the outside world, they believed, proved that normal human relationships were inherently corrupt and destructive. In contrast, their own carefully controlled breeding program had created a community based on genetic excellence and social harmony. This interpretation allowed them to rationalize increasingly extreme measures to protect their isolation. Family members who expressed an interest in the outside world were subjected to re-education sessions designed to reinforce their commitment to genetic purity. Children who showed signs of wanting to leave were confined to the homestead until they demonstrated due devotion to family objectives. Most disturbingly, a few outsiders who accidentally discovered their location were either recruited into the family structure or eliminated as threats to their genetic mission. The winter of 1876 to 1877 brought a sequence of events that would eventually lead to the discovery that changed Samuel Whitaker's life forever. The border conflicts were entering their intense phase, with militia patrols gaining ascendancy throughout western Montana. The Bitterroot, a remote region, was experiencing the brutal suppression that would characterize efforts to control newly settled lands. Militia patrols were conducting systematic searches of remote areas, looking for fugitives from justice, arms, caches, and evidence of subversive activity. It was during one of these searches that a militia patrol first found evidence of the Hawthorne family's existence. In December of 1876, A patrol following reports of fugitive activity in the Bitterroot Valley discovered one of Ruth's messages tucked into the rubble of an abandoned hunting cabin. The note, written in her careful script, described a traditional pioneer community that had maintained a pure bloodline over generations and invited appropriate authorities to visit their ancestral home. The commanding officer, Captain John Harlan, initially dismissed the message as the fancy of some hermit or the ramblings of a vagrant, but something about the precise language and specific geographical references convinced him that it warranted investigation. More importantly, the valley described in the message was precisely the kind of remote location where fugitives from justice or subversives might establish a hideout or arms cache. McKinnon's presence changed the dynamic of the encounter in critical ways. As an American civilian with no direct stake in Spanish political conflicts, he was able to approach the situation with an objectivity that Spanish authorities would have been unable to manage. More importantly, his background as a journalist had trained him to record evidence and preserve testimony in ways that would prove invaluable in understanding the full scope of what had happened in Calderon Valley. The American reporter's initial reaction to the family was a combination of fascination and horror that would shape his reports for decades to come. He immediately recognized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in modern European history, a closed society that had deliberately isolated itself from normal human civilization in pursuit of genetic objectives that were almost science fiction. But McKinnon also recognized that the timing of the discovery created major complications for any official response. Spain was in the middle of a brutal civil war that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions more. The new Franco government was focused on political consolidation and suppressing Republican resistance. The last thing Spanish authorities wanted to deal with was a scandal involving systematic incest in a remote mountain community. The solution that emerged from discussions between Sergeant Rateria and McKinnon reflected the pragmatic realities of wartime administration. The Calderon family would be quietly moved to separate institutions where the children could receive proper care and education while the adults faced prosecution for their crimes. The case would be handled discreetly to avoid generating publicity that could embarrass the new government or provide propaganda material to Republican opponents. McKinnon's role in this arrangement was critical. As an American journalist with international contacts, he could ensure that the case was thoroughly documented and the welfare of the children protected during the transition. In return, he would agree to delay publication of his findings until Spanish authorities had completed their investigation and reached some resolution of the situation. What neither of them anticipated was that the temporary delay in publication would stretch into decades, eventually becoming a permanent silence that would keep the story of the Calderon family buried in classified archives until long after all the participants had died. Just when we think we've seen it all, the horror in Payne's Valley only intensifies. If this story sent shivers down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one. Let's explore what happens next in the tale of Europe's most isolated bloodline. The full extent of the Hawthorne family's genetic experiments was revealed during a week-long investigation in February of 1877 that Whitaker later described as a descent into a living nightmare that defied everything I thought I knew about human civilization. Working alongside Montana medical authorities who had been sworn to absolute secrecy about the case, the American reporter documented evidence of systematic breeding practices that had produced results both more extensive and more disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. Medical examinations of family members revealed patterns of genetic abnormality that painted a clear picture of the consequences of concentrated inbreeding. Dr. William Carver, a physician from the Chicago Medical College who was sworn to secrecy about the case, concluded that the Hawthorne family represented the most genetically isolated human population in recorded history, with levels of genetic homozygosity exceeding anything previously documented in scientific literature. The physical manifestations of this genetic concentration were evident throughout the family. Nearly every member exhibited some form of developmental abnormality, ranging from relatively minor issues such as abnormal tooth formation and bone irregularities to severe problems including profound mental retardation. congenital deafness, and various forms of organ malformation. The infant mortality rate was approximately 60%, with most deaths occurring within the first year of life due to complications related to genetic disorders. But the physical abnormalities, as horrifying as they were, paled in comparison to the psychological impact of the family's breeding practices on the surviving members. The children and adolescents who had grown up on the homestead exhibited a complete lack of normal social development. They had been raised to view their siblings, parents, and cousins exclusively through the lens of genetic utility, evaluating family relationships based on potential breeding outcomes rather than emotional bonds. Whitaker's interviews with family members revealed the full extent of their psychological conditioning. Martha, now the primary leader of the family, spoke with clinical detachment about her role in selecting breeding pairs and overseeing pregnancy outcomes. She maintained detailed records not only of genetic combinations, but also of performance evaluations for family members, assessing their contributions to the genetic improvement program with numerical scores that determined their status in the family hierarchy. The children, ranging in age from infants to young adults, exhibited a level of indoctrination that Whitaker found almost incomprehensible. They spoke matter-of-factly about their predetermined roles in future breeding schedules, evaluating their siblings as potential partners with scientific objectivity, and expressing genuine enthusiasm for participating in what they had been taught was a sacred mission of genetic purification. Most disturbing was the discovery of Ruth's hidden journals, which provided a day-by-day account of the family's development over 2 decades. Her meticulously maintained records documented not only breeding decisions and their outcomes, but also the psychological techniques that had been used to maintain family cohesion and prevent rebellion against the system. The journals revealed that several family members had actually attempted to escape over the years, but they had been systematically hunted down, subjected to brutal re-education processes, and either brought back into compliance or eliminated as threats to family security. The escape attempts had led to the development of increasingly sophisticated control mechanisms. Family members were forbidden from traveling alone outside the immediate homestead area. Children were subjected to regular loyalty tests designed to identify potential dissidents before they could act on rebellious impulses. Most effectively, the family had developed a complex system of mutual surveillance, with family members required to report any signs of disloyalty or desire to leave the community. These control mechanisms had been justified through an elaborate ideological framework that combined twisted Puritan theology with pseudo-scientific theories of genetic superiority. Family members were taught that they were participating in God's work to purify humanity, and that any betrayal of their mission would not only lead to personal damnation, but would also corrupt the entire human race. This theological justification made it almost impossible to resist the system for individuals who had been raised within its confines. The investigation also revealed the full extent of the family's isolation from normal American society. They had developed their own monetary system based on genetic contributions rather than currency exchange. Their calendar was organized around breeding cycles rather than religious or civil holidays. Most importantly, they had created their own legal system, with Martha serving as judge, jury, and executioner for any infringements against the family's genetic policies. Whitaker's most chilling discovery came when he examined the family's expansion plans. Rather than being content with their current population, the leadership had developed elaborate strategies for recruiting new genetic material from outside sources. They had identified several other isolated families in the region who might be suitable for absorption into their breeding program, and they had begun to make contact with these potential targets through carefully crafted deception campaigns. The recruitment strategy involved approaching isolated families during times of crisis, death, economic hardship, or political persecution, and offering assistance in exchange for marital alliances. Young people from target families would be invited to join the Hawthorne homestead as spouses for family members, but they would not be informed of the true nature of the community until they were physically and psychologically trapped within the system. Several such recruitments had been successful. Whitaker uncovered evidence that at least 6 individuals from outside families had been absorbed into the Hawthorne genetic program over the preceding decade. These recruits had been systematically isolated from their original families, subjected to intensive indoctrination processes, and eventually integrated into the breeding schedule as if they had been born into the system. The fate of those who resisted integration was documented in Ruth's journals with clinical precision. Individuals who refused to participate in the breeding program were subjected to increasing levels of psychological and physical coercion until they either complied or were deemed beyond salvation. Those in the latter category simply vanished from the records with brief notes indicating they had been returned to God or had chosen to seek their fortune elsewhere. Whitaker's investigation revealed that the family had developed sophisticated techniques for disposing of both resistant recruits and genetically flawed offspring. A series of unmarked graves in the forest surrounding the homestead contained the remains of at least 20 individuals whose deaths had never been reported to civil authorities. The graves were arranged in a methodical pattern that suggested regular use over an extended period, indicating that the elimination of unsuitable individuals had become a routine aspect of the family's genetic management system. Whitaker's most chilling discovery came when he found evidence that the family's activities had been known to some Montana authorities for years, but had been deliberately ignored due to their remote location and the chaos of the border conflict era. Local pastors had received reports of unusual family activities, but had dismissed them as rural superstitions. Government officials had been informed of missing persons in the area, but had attributed these disappearances to conflict-related violence rather than systematically investigating them. This official negligence had allowed the family to operate with complete impunity for over 2 decades, expanding their genetic experiments and recruitment activities while remaining virtually invisible to the outside world. The discovery in 1877 was not due to any systematic effort to investigate rural communities, but purely by accident during a militia patrol that was looking for fugitives from justice. The realization that such extensive criminal activity could continue undetected for such a long period raised profound questions about the effectiveness of governmental oversight in rural Montana and the vulnerability of isolated populations to exploitation by predators. Whitaker recognized that the Hawthorne case represented not merely an isolated incident of family dysfunction, but a systemic failure of social institutions that had grave implications for the protection of vulnerable populations across the country. The dismantling of the Hawthorne homestead in March of 1877 required a carefully coordinated effort involving medical professionals, social workers, and security personnel who were sworn to absolute secrecy about the operation. Montana authorities, already overwhelmed by the challenges of establishing order in the frontier, were determined to handle the situation with the minimum possible publicity that could embarrass local government or create international complications. Whitaker witnessed 43 individuals being removed from the only world most of them had ever known and distributed among various institutions across western Montana. The youngest children, those under the age of 10, were placed in Protestant orphanages where they could receive proper schooling and hopefully overcome the psychological trauma of their initial conditioning. Older children and adolescents were sent to specialized facilities that combined medical treatment for their genetic disorders with intensive rehabilitation programs designed to prepare them for integration into normal society. The adult members of the family faced a more complex fate. Martha and several other leaders of the breeding program were quietly prosecuted for crimes including incest, child abuse, kidnapping, and multiple counts of murder. Their trials, however, were conducted in closed sessions with sealed records to prevent public knowledge of the case. Most received lengthy prison sentences, although several died in custody within a few years due to the effects of their genetic disorders and the stress of adapting to life outside their isolated community. Ruth, whose journals had provided crucial evidence for understanding the family's operations, posed a particular dilemma for authorities. Her detailed records had made the investigation possible, but she was also clearly complicit in decades of criminal activity. The solution was to offer her immunity from prosecution in exchange for continued cooperation with researchers studying the genetic and psychological effects of extreme isolation and inbreeding. Under this arrangement, Ruth spent the final years of her life working with Dr. William Carver and other scientists who were attempting to understand the full implications of the Hawthorne case. Her insights into the family's psychological conditioning techniques and genetic selection processes provided invaluable data for later research that would shape policies on child protection and the detection of isolated abuse situations. Ruth, whose journals had provided crucial evidence for understanding the family's operations, posed a particular dilemma for authorities. Her detailed records had made the investigation possible, but she was also clearly complicit in decades of criminal activity. The solution was to offer her immunity from prosecution in exchange for continued cooperation with researchers studying the genetic and psychological effects of extreme isolation and inbreeding. Under this arrangement, Ruth spent the final years of her life working with Dr. William Carver and other scientists who were attempting to understand the full implications of the Hawthorne case. Her insights into the family's psychological conditioning techniques and genetic selection processes provided invaluable data for later research that would shape policies on child protection and the detection of isolated abuse situations. The physical homestead itself was thoroughly documented and then systematically destroyed. Whitaker participated in this process, photographing every room, cataloging every document, and preserving evidence that would later be sealed in the archives of the Montana government. The genealogical charts that had covered the walls were carefully copied before being burned, creating a permanent record of what Dr. Carver called the most comprehensive documentation of human inbreeding ever assembled. The unmarked graves in the forest surrounding the homestead were exhumed and their contents carefully analyzed. The remains of 23 individuals were found, ranging from infants who had died shortly after birth to adults who appeared to have been murdered when they attempted to leave the family or resist breeding demands. Each set of remains told a story of the systematic violence that had been necessary to maintain the family's genetic isolation. The American reporter's role in the aftermath of the discovery proved to be both professionally challenging and personally traumatic. His initial agreement to delay publication while Montana authorities handled the situation seemed reasonable, but as months stretched into years without any resolution, he began to realize that the case would never be made public through official channels. The local government had too much invested in projecting an image of traditional American values and social stability to risk the international embarrassment that would come from revealing the existence of such an extensive incestuous operation. The American reporter made several attempts to publish his findings through international media outlets, but he was repeatedly blocked by a combination of pressure from Montana authorities and the reluctance of editorial boards to print stories that seemed too extreme to be credible. The few editors who were willing to consider publication demanded verifiable sources and official confirmation that Montana authorities were unwilling to provide. Frustrated by these obstacles, Whitaker eventually decided to submit his entire body of material to the U.S. Department of the Interior, hoping that future researchers or journalists might gain access to the material when political conditions changed. His sealed report, submitted in 1879, included thousands of pages of testimony, hundreds of photographs, and detailed genealogical records that provided a comprehensive picture of the Hawthorne family's 2 decades of genetic experimentation. The fate of the surviving family members varied significantly depending on their age, physical condition, and psychological adaptability. The youngest children, those who had been removed before the age of 5, were generally successful in adapting to normal social environments and eventually assimilated into American society without much evidence of their unusual origins. Several of these children were adopted by families who were never told of their background, allowing them to grow up without the stigma of their genetic heritage. Older children and adolescents faced more significant challenges. Many suffered from physical disabilities that required ongoing medical treatment, while others exhibited psychological problems that made social integration difficult or impossible. Some lived out their lives in care facilities, never fully overcoming the conditioning they had received during their early years on the homestead. Perhaps most tragically, several of the rescued family members were unable to adapt to outside life and continually attempted to return to the mountains where their homestead had been located. These individuals had been so thoroughly conditioned to view their isolated existence as superior to normal society that they experienced the wider world as chaotic, corrupt, and morally inferior. At least 3 former family members committed suicide, rather than continue to live in what they considered to be an alien and hostile environment. The long-term impact of the Hawthorne case extended far beyond the immediate fate of the family members themselves. Dr. William Carver's research on the genetic effects of extreme inbreeding contributed to significant advances in understanding genetic disorders and the medical consequences of genetic isolation. His work also influenced the development of screening programs designed to identify and assist other isolated communities that might be vulnerable to similar forms of systematic abuse. More broadly, the case highlighted the need for improved oversight of rural populations and better protections for individuals living in remote areas where traditional social controls might break down. Montana authorities, despite their reluctance to publicize the Hawthorne case, implemented new policies requiring regular visits to isolated communities by social workers and medical personnel. Whitaker's sealed report remained classified for over 20 years, eventually becoming available to researchers in the 1,890 seconds as part of a broader declassification of border conflict-era documents. Even then, access was restricted to qualified academic researchers who agreed to maintain the anonymity of the surviving family members and their descendants. The American reporter himself was profoundly changed by his encounter with the Hawthorne family. He continued his journalism career for several more decades, reporting on conflicts and social issues across the American West, but colleagues noted that he never again exhibited the same optimism about human nature that had characterized his earlier work. In interviews conducted near the end of his life, Whitaker described the Hawthorne case as a glimpse into the darkness that exists within human beings when all social restraints are removed and all ethical boundaries are ignored. The final chapter of the Hawthorne story came in 1894, when Ruth died in a nursing home in Helena, Montana, at the age of 56. She had spent the last 2 decades of her life working with researchers and occasionally meeting with journalists who had gained access to the declassified documents. To the very end, she maintained that the family's breeding program, despite its horrifying consequences, had been motivated by a sincere belief in genetic improvement and human perfection. Her death marked the end of living memory of the family's activities, but the documentation she had helped preserve continues to provide valuable insights for researchers studying extreme social isolation, systematic abuse, and the psychological mechanisms that enable ordinary people to engage in extraordinary cruelty. The Hawthorne case has become a standard reference in academic literature on family dysfunction, genetic counseling, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Today, the valley where the Hawthorne homestead once stood remains largely uninhabited. Local residents still whisper about the cursed family that once lived there, and occasional hikers report finding the remains of log foundations in the forest. Montana authorities have never publicly acknowledged the case, and official records of the investigation remain sealed under laws protecting family privacy and local security. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Hawthorne sisters and their shared husband continues to influence our understanding of human behavior under extreme conditions. Their story serves as a reminder that civilization is a fragile construct, easily corrupted when isolation and fanatical ideology combine to create closed systems, immune to outside scrutiny and moral correction. This dark chapter of American Western history shows us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural creatures from folklore, but ordinary people who convince themselves that their horrific actions serve some higher purpose. The Hawthorne family believed they were creating genetic perfection, but they only produced suffering, disability, and death, a testament to the corrupting power of absolute isolation and the human capacity for self-deception in the service of twisted ideals. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed, or could there still be other isolated communities hidden from the world, pursuing their own dark visions of human improvement? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on this haunting tale from the Bitterroot Mountains. If you enjoyed exploring this most disturbing family secret in history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker mysteries of our past. See you in the next episode, where we continue to unearth the buried horrors that have shaped our world.